This is now the case of a patient with a high defibrillation threshold and one episode of VF that will require the delivery of 6 electrical shocks. You see here the onset of the arrhythmia classified in the VF zone, then an initial detection of VF, and the first charge of the capacitors. At the end of the charge, the first shock is delivered, but this shock is inefficient, and then there is a redetection of the VF and a second charge of the capacitors. The second shock is delivered. It is also inefficient, with redetection and onset of the third charge of the capacitors. Then there is spontaneous modification of the aspect of the arrhythmia from ventricular fibrillation to unorganized and monomorphic ventricular tachycardia. But when the shock is delivered, you see the induction of a new episode of ventricular fibrillation. This is not surprising in a patient with a high threshold to see induction of a polymorphic arrhythmia with the shock, since there is a direct relation between the capacity to induce a polymorphic arrhythmia and the incapacity to terminate a ventricular fibrillation with the same amount of energy. This is the concept of upper limit of vulnerability. The shock number 3, 4, and 5 were unsuccessful, and you see now the effect of the very last shock of the series with a return to sinus. So the 6th shock was successful with return to sinus. In this patient with high threshold and elevated risk, we decided to implant a subcutaneous array to decrease the threshold of defibrillation. From this example, we will now discuss what are the parameters that you can program in St. Jude Medical Abbott devices to optimize the efficacy of the electrical shock in the VF zone. To optimize the efficacy of an electrical shock, different parameters can be programmed. The amplitude, of course, but also the waveform, the mode, the configuration, and the polarity. Concerning the waveform, there is the choice between biphasic and monophasic, but nowadays we know that the thresholds are better with the biphasic shocks. So in case of high threshold, this parameter is usually not modified. When a dual coil lead has been implanted, 3 options of shock configuration are programmable. The dual coil option, or the single coil between the RV coil to the can, or the configuration that is called the cold can between the 2 coils. For the polarity, you can change program either anode or cathode. It is anode by default. It means that all 6 shocks will be with an anodal configuration, which is in fact a configuration with the RV coil as the anode for the first phase of the biphasic shock, and the RV coil is then the cathode for the second phase of the biphasic shock. The dynamic TX algorithm can be programmed on only if a dual coil lead has been implanted and the shock configuration, the dual coil configuration, has been programmed. If the device diagnoses a short circuit with this configuration, it will not have the possibility to deliver a shock, but it will systematically and automatically change the configuration to single coil or cold can configuration to have the possibility to deliver the shock. There's been extensive literature about the interest of optimizing the waveform mode in St. Jude medical devices. By default, it is programmed on tilt. It means that at a fixed tilt, by default 65% for each of the 2 phases, The shock is interrupted when the residual capacitor voltage has reached a fixed percentage. So the measured pulse duration is a function of the impedance, where the energy delivered is fixed. And once more, the tilt of both phases is the same. Without entering too much into details, it is possible in St. Jude medical devices, and that's a specificity of these devices, it is possible to reprogram the waveform mode to pulse width. We know that the optimal duration of the second phase during a biphasic shock depends on the duration of the first phase, the defibrillation impedance, and the membrane time constant. If there is a high threshold and also a high defibrillation impedance, it is possible to optimize the duration of both phases and reprogram with a fixed pulse duration, so the pulse width. A high impedance indicates an impediment in the transmission of the current. Therefore, to deliver the same amount of energy, a long pulse duration is needed, including a risk of hyperpolarization and loss of energy. Consequently, it is preferable to limit the pulse duration. Depending on the measured impedance, the ICD will suggest a series of optimal duration in 3 colors. Blue corresponds to a typical time constant, green to a more rapid constant, and yellow to a slower time constant. Therefore, this kind of programming can be programmed in patients with high threshold and high defibrillation impedance.